Odd, Funny, and Flawed, a testimony of surprising events which God performed. It's the story of our life. Admittedly, we will never understand everything God allowed, yet we know they were part of His perfect plan for His glory and our redemption. Now, bear with me as I tell about our story. Undeniable, amazing events, obviously orchestrated by God, circumstances which were clearly beyond our control. Chapter 1. Here, There, Everywhere.
My dad used to say, "I'd rather owe it to you than cheat you out of it." I guess he was true to his word, as he owed just about everyone we knew. When I would tell people we moved every year, they would invariably ask, "Was your dad in the military?" No, I'd say he just liked to move. Truth was, he would either get run out of town by creditors, or we would sneak out of town to avoid them. We had lived in half a dozen towns by the time I was 7. There were many nights we were awakened, told to pack our bags and be off. Even though we moved frequently, we never left California. Dad said it was the only state with perfect weather. Years later, as my husband and I traveled, I would point out towns I had lived in. I lived there when I was 11, I'd say, as we passed signposts on the freeway. We moved there when I was 6, but for only a few months, as I nodded toward a billboard. Driving through Modesto, I said I'll never forget living on Cook Street. I was 5 when I drank from a hose and my tongue swelled from a bug bite. Recalling events in each town as we passed through gave me a fairly accurate record of my age at the time. Carol Jean was the oldest sibling. She was 13 when I was born. Dad decided my name should be Geraldine to rhyme with Carol Jean. To this day, I'm grateful Mom convinced him to name me Jolene instead. My brother Jim was 6 years older, and Stan was only 2 when I came along. Making friends was especially difficult for the 2 oldest. Once Carol Jean entered high school, she refused to move with us, so Dad left her behind to live with friends. For Stan and me, moving was exciting. We looked forward to exploring the neighborhood and meeting new people. We were never in one place long enough to develop relationships, so Stan was not only my brother, but also my best friend. There wasn't a time in our life when anyone could remember us quarreling. Still, we were always in trouble. Our giggles and teasing would escalate into uncontrollable bellows of hoots and snorts, until Dad yelled, "Stop laughing!" In a vain effort to muffle our cackles, we would drop our heads and cover our mouths until we were composed. Then we'd slowly turn to look at each other, which only produced a second eruption of laughter. Carol Jean said it was just plain irritating, the way we giggled all the time. My earliest memory of Stan was when the 2 of us were walking to a park in Modesto. I must have been about 5. I ran ahead in anticipation of the fun I was about to enjoy, when a couple of young boys blocked my path. They smirked and leaned forward in a threatening gesture. Before I could cry out, Stan was there between us. Fists raised, he was ready to protect me. The kids backed off, and Stan reassured me with his hand on my shoulder the rest of the way. It never occurred to me that moving so often was unusual. I rather looked forward to it. In fact, I recall one incident when I not only looked forward to it, but was thankful to move. It was 1957. Stan and I were digging holes in a friend's backyard. I was making mud pies with a glass bowl, minding my own business, when the neighbor boy squirted me with a hose. Furious, I stood up and threw the bowl at him. It broke into a couple of large, sharp pieces. I stood paralyzed as his screams pierced my ears and alerted his parents. "Don't move," his father shouted as he ran to the site. "There's glass everywhere." What had I done? I shuddered, looking past the anxious observers. I saw what all the commotion was about. A small scratch with barely a trickle of blood, not even worth wasting a Band-Aid to cover. Certainly the hysteria did not fit the deed. However, panic gripped me as I felt the tight squeeze of his mother's fingers on the back of my neck. She silently marched me home at a pace that nearly had me running. The sound of my father's footsteps seemed louder than normal as she banged on our door. When it flung open, she pushed me inside. Without even a word of introduction, she exaggerated the entire ordeal in a flurry of angry words. I cowered close by, half shaking from the cold and half from fear of what Dad might do. His demeanor had the telltale signs of an interrupted quarrel with my mother. With eyes wide open, I was sure to get the brunt of his rage. Without warning, he leaned toward my escort and shouted, "It doesn't matter, we're moving anyway," and slammed the door in her face. I hurried to my room to avoid punishment.
Of all the children, Stan was the favorite, but I believe I loved him the most.
He was so thoughtful, respectful, and polite, yet full of fun and clever ideas. He was a natural-born entrepreneur, and included me in all his ventures. When he found a case of Drano cleaner in our garage, Stan pleaded with Dad to let us sell them door to door. Dad was reluctant at first, but at Stan's insistence, he conceded. It wasn't long before we were back with the empty crate. Surprised at how quickly we returned, Dad grew suspicious. "How much were you charging?" he demanded. Proudly, pulling the coins from his pocket, Stan said 25 cents. Scowling, Dad growled, "I paid 50 cents for each one of those." Suddenly we were at attention. An angry lecture ensued over the value of money, something we had very little of, but ended with Dad chuckling. Stan's humble attitude and our sales ability had softened his heart. Although I was just a tag-along, Stan always shared his spoils with me. At age 9, he mowed lawns for $1 and gave me a quarter for supervising. He convinced the gas station owner next door to pay us a penny for every fly we killed. At age 10, he heard there was money to be made collecting rare pennies. So to start his collection, the two of us walked into town and he asked the local store owners if we could look through their cash boxes for old coins. I can't recall a single refusal. When we found a valuable 3-legged buffalo nickel, we rushed home to show Dad. The next day, Dad took us to the bank where he exchanged paper money for a bag of coins to look through. Dad was always impressed with his youngest son's ambition. Stan's interest in coin collecting was sparked by a camping trip with family friends he had taken a few months earlier. They found a large canvas bag full of pennies buried in the riverbed. The family speculated it might have been hidden there after a bank robbery. It was an unprecedented opportunity for a future coin collector such as himself. Every time Stan repeated the story, he added with regret, "It was 1959. I wish we had checked the dates before we spent them." Stan had many talents. Teaching me sales was just one of them. He also taught me to fish, play chess, and collect stamps and coins. He also loved to play games, and we often pretended to be imaginary characters. The one I remember best was performing in a circus as badminton champions. Our job was to hit the birdie back and forth at least 100 times in front of an invisible crowd. Stan was very intense as we counted the strikes. 67, 68, 69, we were only given 3 chances to prove we were good enough to be hired to entertain the audience. If we missed that plastic birdie, Stan warned, "You know the circus master will fire us." "Oh," Stan would cry, hitting his forehead with the palm of his hand as the birdie fell to the ground for the 3rd time. He'd look at me glumly and say, "We're going to have to find another carnival." My shoulders would slump and I'd sigh with a downcast look. "Don't worry, Joe," he'd encourage. "We'll find another circus somewhere." Then tossing the birdie into the air, we'd start fresh with a new imaginary audience cheering us on.